as the first sort of reader, the title called Trajectories, and the subtitle is Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. Most people don't quite know that, but because of that, it's because of that book, and that book was a collection of essays from the conference itself. And most people who are on the editorial board eventually had essays published in that particular issue, particular volume. I'm not sure it's still in print. It's published by Routledge. So sometime during the conference, at the time, one of the commissioning editors from Walailak actually proposed that we do a journal. And that the idea started from there, and in a hotel room in Taipei, where the conference people were staying, and then the idea came up, and then we kind of said, okay, it's doable, so we agreed to do it. All right, so the beginning is not something that we planned for. It sort of happened because I think it happened because at the time the editor, Rebecca Parton, had a vision of how it would fly. And it wasn't even we didn't even think about it, but the proposal actually came from a commissioning editor that has a vision of that journal. So that was the beginning. But then before we even go to print, we actually spent a lot of time traveling. Guangxin and I had traveled essentially to many different Asian locations, finding people who we think who are able to work together. So it took us 3 years of planning before we actually launched the very first issue. By that time, we would have had meeting in Shanghai, in Bangalore, in Seoul, and in different parts in Singapore. And we already had a fairly established list of fairly established writers by that time. Okay, so a lot of the questions that I was just at another panel on publishing from the South. I think there was a lot of questions there that were all about how many of the questions about young scholars worrying about publishing papers in journals that are not recognized by the institution. We kind of didn't have that problem, or we didn't really care, because the first few issues of Inter-Asia Cultures Studies were all by people who do not have to worry about credentials, who not have to worry about job future, because it was a fairly established kind of list of people that we published. I mean, I think now we are facing the same kind of question, same kind of issue with young scholars who have to worry a lot. But then, for our case, by now, we are in some sense the sort of the established journal where you will get credit from any institutions if you publish with us, right? So, so the beginning was, a fairly sort of, in some sense, unplanned. But once we got going, we were pretty serious about what we were doing and did a lot of groundwork before we got started. And as I said, for the first 2 or 3 years, most of the papers were actually papers we solicited from people we know, whose work we can rely on and get the thing going. Right? So now, in the present moment, this is something maybe upsetting to younger scholars. We have a lot, the number of papers submitted has actually increased significantly. We have now gone from 3 issues to 4 issues to now 6 issues. The number of submissions has increased significantly, but the rate of acceptance haven't actually improved. We're not trying to be difficult. I mean, we don't actually print this sort of 90% rejection rate. Nobody knows what the rejection rate is. Neither Guangxin and I know. I mean, we don't really keep track of such rates. I mean, okay, so that's one. The other thing is that in the present moment, there are a number of issues that I think may be interesting to think about. One of the disturbing issues that Guangxin and I actually had sort of trying to do something about, but we're not actually, is somewhat out of our hands. There are actually, the journal is called Indo-Asia Cultural Studies, but a lot of papers that are submitted has nothing to do with Indo-Asia. There are usually only about one location in which they write from. Now, in a way, that is not a serious problem because in an issue itself, there will be pieces from different locations. So the Indo-Asianness, so to speak, will come from the reader themselves could derive that Indo-Asianness, even if the author doesn't actually explicitly conceptualize Indo-Asia, right? So for us, if you're writing from a particular location, that is still okay because we don't have a problem. Because as I say, part of the experience of Indo-Asianness, the reader has to derive from this for themselves, the kind of, we don't actually talk about comparative studies, which is why we continuously use the term referencing. We use the term Indo-Asia referencing rather than comparative Asian studies because the criteria for referencing in certain sense is much more humanities-based rather than sociology, political science-based. So it's much more relaxed and we use terms like resonance and proximities and all this kind of stuff. It isn't a divided column that says yes, no kind of comparison, right? So that's one. The other thing is, but one of the problems is that reflects the fact that most younger scholars really are actually not Indo-Asian, that they are not traveling, that they are not going to other places beyond their own boundaries to learn about other places, which was something that we actually were quite concerned about in the beginning, from the very beginning, which is to know your local conditions very well, right? And then to be able to actually make references to other locations that you may or may not familiar with. And if you're not familiar with, through your work, you will become familiar. And also, hopefully, through that kind of referencing, become self-reflexive of your own condition and self-transformative. So if you're only writing exclusively from one location, then that kind of learning process doesn't happen. You might get published, but part of the whole motivation behind the idea of being Indo-Asia is not actually part of your experience. So, we would like to encourage the younger scholars to actually travel and not just stay where they are, and to travel across Asia. Which is also why we always organize conferences in minor locations in different countries. It's a very mobile conference every 2 years. And we generally avoid the prime universities in that particular city. Right? So that's one of the important things. The other interesting problem, and this is something that isn't just applied to Indo-Asia culture split. It was kind of interesting to be in the earlier panel to listen to what the editors of the other journals talk about their problems. Because I understand that there's a lot of pressure now among young scholars to get things published and so on. And it's very important that it be accounted for in your annual review. And the interesting thing is that you often often when you try to publish in a kind of more established journal, there is increasingly becomes a format. There has a certain style. You have to, in the first, 2 paragraphs, you have to say exactly what you want to do in the rest of the paper, which makes reading really boring. Okay, I mean, if I read something like that, then I don't have to read for the rest of the paper. I just have to read the first 3 paragraphs and go to the end. And that actually, in some ways, destroys the whole creativity of writing. You are not writing a lab report. You're supposed to be writing an essay, right? So that's a problem. But the much more serious problem beyond that is that very often, because you're looking at publishing in this journal, you tend to take concepts that are existing and then trim the material you have to fit into the concept. Okay, and so your standard reviewers can see that you are in line with the development, with the trend. But then the most interesting thing about where you are has disappeared. All right. So what we would like to see really, as editors, is actually new things, not repetitively reaffirming existing concepts. So technically, you should keep, that's why we emphasize the local so much. You should really keep your local material as strongly, firmly as possible, and try to develop concepts out of that material, and not go shopping for a concept in order to trim your material to fit. The point is to actually know about your place, not about every time you think of any concept that claims to be universal is actually a concept where the history of which has been erased. Okay, so in Indonesian cultural studies, we particularly want you to keep the local. We particularly want you to develop from inside the local and not keep striving to be universal in the sense of just trimming your work. There's a lot of questions asked about how do you get published in the journal. Well, I think that if you study the journal and the style of the editorial style and so on, you could actually quite figure out how to actually fit your material inside. Okay, so for us, we really would prefer not to see that continuous application of standard concepts in that way. I want to make one final point, because we get a lot of, we are a very highly personalized journal. Gonja and I look through almost all the material that comes in. We don't always send every submission out, okay? There's a first cut, because there are papers that come, there are submissions that come in that doesn't fit our audience interests. And we don't want to waste your time, because once you send it out for review, it is another 2 or 3 months before it comes back. So if it doesn't fit, we generally suggest that it doesn't fit, go to somewhere else. Sometimes, if possible, we will suggest alternative sites that you can send to, because there's no point, continuously sending to cultural studies when your work is not in cultural studies, right? And if it's not within our audience, our readers' interest, then we really don't want to waste 3 months of your time. So if you actually get something that says, sorry, this is really not for us, go somewhere else, don't be offended. We are actually trying to save you time and not to actually put you down, okay? Finally, there is a very high tendency to be trendy. Trendy is not good, okay? I just want to give you a very straightforward example, which might come as a shock or as an insult to you. We have so many essays from BL, we can't publish any more BL. I can't even stand to look at another submission on BL, all right? And that's you know, that's because a lot of graduate students basically follow trends rather than do what they really want to be doing. And then it's because following trend, the assumption is if you follow trend, you could publish easier. All right, maybe it is, but we are not it. Okay, so yeah, I'm sure you might have questions, but let me stop here.